Well, this morning we have a very special speaker here, and most of you are familiar with Whitney, and her biography is in your bulletin this morning, and I invite you to listen as I read that along. Whitney Johnson, pronouns are she and her. Somebody left out the HR in there, has been a member of Madrona Grace Presbyterian Church for over 25 years, serving on session for 7 years and supporting Julia's Place, Madrona Commons, and working with Church Council of Greater Seattle, Faith Action Network, FAN, and the Seattle Interfaith Migrant Rights Committee. Whitney has lived in Seattle Central District for 30 plus years and has invited into a life of faith service through the model of her grandparents, Whittier and Marjorie Johnson, who became members of Madrona after the integration of Grace and Madrona Presbyterian Church in 1953. Whitney is grateful to work for the Communities of Opportunities, COO, initiative with Public Health Seattle and King Counties. In support of community power, building and systems of policy change, efforts across our region, and is a proud graduate of Garfield High School. Go Bulldogs. I first met Whitney just getting to know her, and it is always through lunches and breakfasts. I heard a lot about her even before I met her, just the work that she did here at this church, and not here just at this church, but this community. And for me, every time we've met, she's always been an inspiration to me. She's always been an encouragement to me. She's always the one to tell me just to hang in there, keep going, and keep going. And so when she found out that she was going to speak today, we invited her to speak, I was pretty excited about this. Not just her own story, but just the story of her family and what they've given to this church and to this community. Her mother is a member here, and the history she's done here. But Whitney has a lot to share today. She has a lot to inspire us today. And I'm grateful to introduce you to her now. Whitney Johnson.
Thank you, Pastor. Good morning. And again, for those who may not know me, as Reggie mentioned, my name is Whitney Johnson. And for those who don't know, I'm not a pastor. I'm not a graduate of any kind of school of theology. I'm not a historian or sociologist. And I'm not even particularly well-versed, if I'm being honest. Nor do I have an exceptional memory for Scripture. So today's sermon may look a little different than you were expecting. Bear with me. But I was graciously invited by Pastor Reggie and the Anti-Racism Committee to talk today about my family in general, and the church in regards to Black History Month, as well as the role that the church can play in service of our neighborhood and the communities that we are all a part of. You may be thinking, why are you, me, the one speaking on this? I think that's a fair question. And to start, I'll give a little bit more background about myself and my relationship to Madrona Grace, why I think I was invited to talk today. Beginning with the fact that I, as Reggie mentioned, previously served on session for 7 years, concluding my term as clerk in 2019, just before the pandemic. And for those who know our polity well, you know that ruling elders, and once an elder, always an elder, can be invited to preach, and in some cases are even commissioned to preach and lead worship. So a very quick aside here, but I do want to say, if you feel a call or responsibility for the leadership, guidance, and government of Madrona Grace under the will of Christ, and to give effective witness of God's creation, spirit, and mission in this place. And maybe you also like public speaking? Think about saying yes when the nominating committee calls you with a question about serving on session and volunteering your talents and leadership for this community. Okay, end of plug. Second, despite the lack of melanin currently present at the pulpit, I am mixed, I'm biracial, and I'm very proud to be Black and grateful for my lineage of faithful African American people In particular, my grandparents who brought me to this church, and for their model of service and commitment to community here at Madrona and in the Central District community in which I was raised and still live, as well as my mother Anne, who's here, and my great-grandmother and great-uncle, who were also a part of the Madrona community during their lives and models of strength, faith, and perseverance for our family. Lastly, in addition to my family, I would be remiss in not acknowledging the broader inheritance I have received in being raised within this church. And to be able to be raised up in a community of predominantly Black families whose faith and commitments were obvious to me as a child, through their actions and their love, and who have also been intergenerational members of this church, including the Motons, Galen, who's on Zoom, Joyce Williams, who's here, and her mother and daughter, the Jones family, Marla Jones, who also has served on session for several years, as well as many who have passed, the Dawsons, Edeltons, Rosses, Loves, Whites, and many others. It is a blessing to have grown up in a church that, while not ever perfect, very visibly did its best to act justly, love steadfastly, and walk wisely before God. So I started attending Madrona around the age of about 5 or 6 years old, and I have a few clear memories from that time. The first, and perhaps earliest memory, is of Andy. Now, Andy was a puppet, and at least one Sunday a month, the children in the church had to come down here to the front and listen to a presentation or take part in a little skit with Andy. So to picture him, Andy, if you're familiar with the Muppets, he was sort of like the younger brother of Muppet characters Statler and Waldorf. So to me then, and me now, I thought it was a bit of an odd choice to preach the word of God to a bunch of children through a character that has the potential to haunt them in their dreams. I remember thinking to myself, even as a child, why am I up here? I'm supposed to pretend that I'm anything but put off by this strange puppet who's also very clearly being operated by some man behind a curtain, and that this puppet has particular insight on the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. It didn't really make sense to me. My second earliest memory was more about the process of church, the getting ready, the having to sit in the pew and wait not just for the service, but all of the adult things and conversations that had to happen before we could leave, which often enough included things that I got voluntold to do. During these years, my grandparents drove a carpool for other members of the church, and so I had to wake up an additional couple of hours early on Sunday mornings to get my Sunday best on and join them to pick up the 2 or 3 others who we'd be taking to church and then bringing home. My job was to escort them to and from the car and then squeeze into the middle seat when necessary, which, as a somewhat relevant aside, I also get carsick quite easily. One of these carpoolers was a woman named Edna Sampong. She was from Ghana and for a time was the lead and only volunteer for the children's ministry. I remember her being a strict Sunday school teacher, and as the person who devised our Sunday children's musical performances, which meant practicing for and then singing traditional Ghanaian church songs, as well as traditional American holiday songs, and bell ringing in front of the congregation. By and large, I did not like this. I didn't like any of it, and I didn't like coming to church. I didn't like Andy. I didn't like waking up early, and wearing the clothes that were picked out for me. I didn't enjoy having to spend so much time with my grandparents and their peers, nor did I like singing poorly for them. I remember asking my mother at one point, "Why do I have to go to church? It's not fair that I don't get the choice to come to church or not. And kids should have rights, you know?" I don't recall exactly how that conversation was resolved, but I attended this church until I graduated from high school. I share these stories not to denigrate the very kind efforts of previous church members who held space here and shared their teachings with me, or to diverge from the request for my speaking today, but only because I believe that the most of what I can offer is grounded in this personal experience. There's so much that could be said, and likely said better, by someone else about the role of the church and community, family, culture, as well as the church's relationship to the Black family, faith, service, Black history, and even about Madrona Grace. I certainly do not intend to provide any subject matter expertise on any of these topics, but I can reflect on my own upbringing here and my family's commitments to this place and to our community, and the meaning and importance of this church to those things in my life. As is mentioned in my bio, my grandparents attended Grace Presbyterian, which was the Black Presbyterian congregation in the Central District, in a building that is no longer in existence today off of Cherry and 23rd. They then joined Madrona Presbyterian after the forced merger of the two churches and the sale of Grace Presbyterian in 1953. If you are unaware of or interested in learning a little bit more about the history of this event and the much later reconciliation process, there are many wonderful articles and a few videos that delve into the details, and I recommend that you look at them. My grandparents had moved to the Seattle area from West Virginia in the 1940s, first to Bremerton, so my grandfather could work in the shipyard, and where my uncle was born. During this time, my grandfather, along with James Walker Sr., staged the first sit-in protest against racial discrimination in the city at a drugstore that sold Black children milkshakes but would make them go outside to eat them. Shortly after this, my grandparents, like many other Black families during this time, moved to Seattle's Central District. First to a small single-story duplex just at the bottom of the hill here in what is now considered Madrona. And then with the support of my grandmother's brother, purchased a home on 26th and Union, the home that I was raised in and where I currently live. During their lives, both my grandfather, Whittier, and my grandmother, Marjorie, worked and volunteered in organizations and in roles for the betterment of their family, community, and church. Despite being prevented from the opportunity for higher education, or perhaps because of this, they both were particularly invested in the well-being and education of youth and young people. My grandfather was a scout leader and local volunteer for the HBCU, Hampton University, and was also a regular support and volunteer to the Madrona Presbyterian tutoring program, founders and leads, Jim Moten and my grandmother. My grandmother worked for many years in early childhood education, including opening the Little School Central Branch Preschool in 1968 with her co-founder and colleague, Pat Milgard. The school still exists today as Central Branch Preschool in Mount Baker. The story that I've heard shared of its founding is that they started a purposely racially integrated preschool in response to the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. But the actual beginnings of the school are earlier. The co-founders were motivated to provide high-quality early childhood education for a racially diverse and integrated cohort of students, and that the school specifically includes students whose families did not have the financial means to pay. Preschools at the time, including the school they worked in, were both predominantly white and predominantly the domain of middle to upper class families. Their focus on an integrated classroom in terms of race, wealth, and income included asking for a commitment from families with more means to pay more in tuition in order to provide for the attendance of others, and even for them to participate in a carpool so that transportation needs would not be a barrier for any child. The opening of the school in 1968 obviously came at a time of broader demands for racial equality, class and gender consciousness, anti-militarism, the Poor People's Campaign for Economic Justice, and other calls for justice and solidarity. And as we know, at the same time, there was a national and local backlash and increasing racist violence against these struggles, including the murder of Edwin Pratt, who was executive director of the Seattle Urban League, who was shot outside his home in Shoreline, just north of Seattle in 1969, the following year, and whose killers have never been identified. My grandmother served on the board of the Urban League for 4 years, but never really talked about the work she did or her experience at the time. Nor did she or my grandfather talk in depth about why they did what they did or what the work meant to them, including their commitments to Madrona Grace, or at least not to me. She and Pat were interviewed, however, in 1968 about the Little School Central Branch, and I was surprised to learn in reading it that they were opening the school without the necessary funds to operate past the first few months. And what made them think they should continue the venture? According to the interview they had, and I'm quoting here, faith. The author, educator, critic, and professor, Gloria Jean Watkins, also known as Bell Hooks, talks about faith as the foundation of love, and that love itself is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. Love is an act of will, namely both an intention and an action. Will also implies choice. We do not have to love, we choose to love. She goes on to say that an individual does not need to be a believer in a religion to embrace the idea that there is an animating principle in the self, a life force, some of us call it a soul, that when nurtured enhances our capacity to be more fully self-actualized and be able to engage in communion with the world around us. I think this definition is helpful in understanding the deep commitment to a life of faith and service that I observed through the invitation of my grandparents and others here at Madrona Grace. It underscores love, particularly love for oneself, others, family, and community, as an intentional act, built upon and furthering a foundation that binds us together. It fosters both self-development and the development of unity, fellowship, and service within a greater body. And while this animating value of love is not solely the domain of the church, I'm not sure there's another institution that holds the promise and possibility so readily available. Our faith community, whose purpose is to grow the beloved community, whose rituals and their outcomes center on the act of faithfully extending oneself to others in the hopes of transformation, is one such example. Another memory I relate to my upbringing and my family's relationship to the church was a phrase my grandmother would use when discussing church matters. She'd say something akin to, "It's not about the pastor, it's about the church." And I'm not sure what exactly she was referring to at these times, But now as an adult, I have more of a sense of what the challenges of church service and operations can be. And I think her point is well taken, in that her covenant was not to a particular leader, session team, budget amount, number of active ministries, etc., but to a loving relationship with God. And because of that, a commitment to a loving relationship with her neighborhood, community, and to the local and global church. Dr. Joy James, an African-American political philosopher, academic, and author, emphasized the concept of revolutionary love in her work, or agape, a love that is based in commitment and compassion for others. She grapples in her work with the concept and capacity to love in a violent world, particularly for African Americans, who historically and presently are vulnerable to violence and captivity through chattel slavery, the convict prison lease system, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and other systemic racism. She states, "We're doing work like mutual aid because we love each other and need it to survive." This form of love is active and transformative, challenging oppressive systems and going beyond advocacy for the marginalized, but including acts of sacrifice and discomfort. Revolutionary love manifests as a dedication to uplift and protect each member of the community, fostering an environment where everyone is free and can thrive. James also goes on to quote Ominara Mars in her essay entitled in part, "Hope is not a discipline," to say hope requires complete trust and confidence. It requires faith. Faith grounds. Faith is the foundation upon which both our desires and expectations reside. Faith is at the root of our ability to hope. I know that we are in a moment of time, this Black History Month, that for many, including myself, can feel quite hopeless. At the same time, I draw from these lessons about the foundations of faith for the work of a beloved community, as well as the personal lessons learned from being within this particular community through the last 30 plus years. I earlier stated that as a child, perhaps not unusually, I did not like church. And yet, here I am today. I think I can say with some confidence that those formative childhood experiences in this place and the model of service and dedication to this church that I was invited into through my family and within this community have grounded me in a knowledge of love that is not merely an emotion or feeling, but a deliberate choice. A choice that is to be nurtured, supported, and uplifted. This is a love that is grounded in an activating faith in the transformation and in one's own sacrifice for others. So for me at least, the relationship of the church to community, family, and the work of racial justice is one of inextricable connection and meaning-making. Strengthening that foundational stone and covenant to not just service and relationship or community, but the hopeful extension of oneself to others in the way that God has extended love and hope to us. I'll quickly conclude with another memory that created a lasting impression on my perspective. This one is a little bit more vague or general, but no less formative to me when I think about my introduction to church and to church life at Madrona. It's a memory of a very small, if not dwindling, congregation, of mostly older or elderly Black people who faced a series of crises in finances, energy, population, perhaps spirit, and still turned inward to respond to these challenges with hope, sacrifice, and ultimately faith in God and one another. I recently found a copy of a letter my grandmother wrote to the women's leadership group at this time, Ruth Circle, during one such crisis, with a recommendation for sacrificial giving as a model and impetus for the entire congregation. It began with the following from 2 Corinthians. Remember, sparse sowing, sparse reaping. Sow bountifully, and you will reap bountifully. And it is in God's power to provide you richly with every good gift. Thus you will have ample means in yourselves to meet each and every situation, with enough and to spare for every good cause. Now he who provides seed for sowing and bread for food will provide the seed for you to sow, and he will multiply it and swell the harvest of your benevolence, and you will always be rich enough to be generous. I know that we here are rich in many, many things, enough to be generous in the way that this church was to me when I was growing up. Please join me in my closing prayer. Gracious Creator, we thank you for the gift of love that binds us together. Help us to embody love in our communities, to strengthen our faith, and to support the families here so that we may be a source of hope, resilience, and empowerment for others. Guide us in nurturing relationships that reflect your love and justice, and strengthen our spirits so that we may be hopeful servants for one another in your name. Amen. Thank you.
Well, I have to disagree with a couple of things. Theologian, yes. Pastor, yes. Speaker, yes. She hit a home run, didn't she?